In a previous video, I talked about how science should work. In this video, I'm going to return to that question, but talk about it from a different angle. Now, in that previous video, and this is the way a lot of people try to answer this, they treat how should science work as an analytic problem, a problem of logic and reasoning about evidence, sometimes a mathematical problem in statistics, and this is a very important perspective. We learn a lot from these kinds of analytical approaches. We talked previously about Karl Popper trying to find a deductive basis for science to be valid. We talked about Lakatos, talking about how can we validly progress through theories. But this isn't the only perspective on how science should work. Science isn't just an analytic problem about evidence and ideas. It's also a social scientific problem because science is done by people. Science is inherently and inescapably a social enterprise. Scientists get together and they collaborate to do research. They communicate with each other through conferences and journals. Scientists peer review one another's work. We talked about this in a previous video, how in order to get published in many places, you have to convince your peers that the work is worth publishing. Scientists even peer review one another's careers. So in order to advance in your career in many places, including as a university professor, you have to get other scientists to speak up and say that you're doing good work through references. And scientists are social because they work in and run organizations, things like universities or professional societies. So science involves a lot of social activity. And so the question, how should science work, also has to encompass questions about this social activity. Now, one thinker about how science should work from this social perspective who's been influential was a sociologist by the name of Robert Merton. And if you think about how should people work, you can think about things like laws or rules, and we'll talk a little bit about some of that later on when we get to ethics. There are important laws and regulations governing the kinds of work the scientists do. But Merton also talked about norms. Norms aren't as formal and as rigid as laws. Norms are kind of social conventions that guide people in their activities. And Merton, in looking at science and in looking at how scientists interacted with each other, identified 4 norms that he said govern the way scientists work together. These 4 norms he called universalism, communalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. And I'm going to go through these one by one. So universalism is the first of these. And by universalism, what Merton meant was that scientists think scientific claims should be evaluated on impersonal criteria. Impersonal here means independent of the status or personal attributes of its participants. So if someone comes forward and says, I have an argument or I have a piece of evidence, scientists generally say that we're supposed to evaluate the argument or the evidence and not the person making it. The second norm of science that Merton pointed out was communalism. He actually originally called this communism. He was writing back in the 1940s when it didn't have quite the bad name that it has today, but it actually has some interesting commonalities with communism because what he really meant was the communal ownership, in this case, communal ownership of scientific knowledge. So the idea was that scientific knowledge belongs to everyone and should be available to everyone. Scientists shouldn't hoard knowledge so that they alone can make advances. They should share it with the scientific community, and anyone can be part of that, as was shown in the previous norm. The third norm Merton talked about was disinterestedness. This is the idea that scientific activities should be done for the benefit of the common scientific enterprise, not for the personal gain of individual scientists. So when scientists are working together, they have this norm that what you're doing should be for collective increases in knowledge, not just advancing your career. And finally, Merton talked about organized skepticism, the idea that we do all of these activities not just individually inside of our own heads, but we create organizations and institutions to carry out and protect skeptical inquiry. So norms can mean a couple of different things. Sometimes norms are sort of ought norms, like you're supposed to do this because it's good, and sometimes norms are instrumental norms. You do this because it's a means to some end. And Merton thought of these as a means to an end. He thought of these as things that scientists do that help make better scientific products if they follow these norms. But how we should be upholding these norms is also a question that Merton addressed. And you might think, well, maybe individual scientists are just better people than everyone else. These all sound like good things, right? It sounds kind of nice to say, like, scientific knowledge belongs to everyone. That's a value I hold. That's something I personally say I believe in. I try to live it out in my life. Or say, well, we should just listen to, the arguments and not the person making them. But of course, scientists are human beings, and Merton, in fact, did not think scientists are better people than everyone else. Merton wrote, this was when he was writing about disinterestedness, but he really thought of all the norms in this way. He wrote, as far as disinterestedness goes, a passion for knowledge, idle curiosity, altruistic concern with the benefit to humanity, and a host of other special motives have been attributed to the scientist. The quest for distinctive motives appears to be misdirected. So he didn't think scientists are better people than everyone else. When you think about it, scientists, yes, they want to do things like discover cool stuff. Almost everyone who goes into science goes into it because they have this kind of motivation for knowledge and discovery, maybe to help the world. But scientists are human beings, and they're not immune to things like wanting status, wanting to get rich and famous, or just wanting to put food on the table for their families. And so an individual scientist is going to be torn between these different motives. So how is it that scientific communities uphold these norms? It's not by the perfect virtue of the individual scientists in them, rather it's by how scientists interact. So Merton said, involving as it does the verifiability of results, scientific research is under the exacting scrutiny of fellow experts. Otherwise put, the activities of scientists are subject to rigorous policing by other scientists, to a degree perhaps unparalleled in any other field of activity. The demand for disinterestedness has a firm basis in the public and testable character of science, and this circumstance, it may be supposed, has contributed to the integrity of men of science. Of course, Merton should have said women and men or people of science. What this means, what Merton was getting at here, is that the way scientists uphold these norms is by holding one another accountable for upholding these norms. That you don't get to do disinterested science, you don't set aside your personal motives because you're a great person. You set them aside because other scientists look at your evidence and will judge you harshly if you're twisting things for your own gain in a way that isn't supported by the actual evidence you're presenting. Now, this is actually a very old idea in science. So the first scientific organization, or at least the earliest one that's continually existing to this day, was the Royal Society in the United Kingdom. Their motto, when they founded themselves in 1660, their motto is the Latin phrase, nullius in verba. That's Latin for take nobody's word for it. So a founding principle of the oldest continually existing scientific organization is check each other's work. Don't just take somebody's word for it. And we see this today. So the political scientist Arthur Lupia has argued that when you look at the form of a scientific argument, when you look at the way people make scientific arguments in the public sphere, sometimes scientists will do this. They'll say, trust me, I'm an expert with a fancy degree. But when they're pressed on it, they can go deeper than this. This isn't just the only thing that they have available to them. They say, look, maybe it would be nice if you trust me, but if you don't, I will show you the evidence and reasoning that led me to this conclusion, and you can see it for yourself. So it's not just trust me, the globe is warming up or the climate is changing. It's here, look, I can show you the temperature charts, I can show you the modeling. You can look it over and you can criticize it if you want to. If you can come up with a different explanation or a flaw in the argument. You don't just have to take my word for it. So where does this land us? Well, if someone says, believe this because it's science, I'm making some kind of a claim and you should follow what I'm doing, do what I'm saying, and it's because it's science, you are often faced when people make these kinds of claims, and they do it all the time. And sometimes it really is science and sometimes it isn't. So how do you know when you should trust it? The answer is it depends. And this is really a disappointing answer because it's nice to have clear answers. It's kind of a running joke in psychology and other social sciences that the answer to everything is it depends. But the nice thing is we don't just have to say it depends and throw our hands up in the air. We have some ideas about what it depends on. So of course, if you can evaluate all the evidence yourself, you should do that. If you have the expertise, the skills, the knowledge, if someone's making a claim and you can actually dig into the evidence, you should do that. But this is kind of rare in the public sphere. Nobody's an expert in everything. Nobody knows how to evaluate every kind of science and every piece of information. Even scientists, as Naomi Oreskes has pointed out, have to do this about one another's work sometimes when it gets outside of their personal area of expertise. So this is great when we can do it, but it's rare. So what should we do when we can't do this? Well, we should see whether it came out of a scientific process. And as Naomi Oreskes has argued, as Merton would have said, as others have said, there are certain ways that science works that we can see whether the process was working as science is supposed to. So you can ask yourself, are people being transparent about the evidence? Is that available to critics and skeptics to look at? You can ask yourself, are people being open to good faith debate and criticism? Now this one you have to be pretty careful about. Openness doesn't mean they're happy about it, it doesn't mean they're smiling, but it means that they're taking it seriously. And the good faith part is really important because people will often mimic an argument when they're just trying to waste someone's time. I'm just asking questions here. So sometimes you have to kind of dig in. This is not a superficial one to judge. But when there are serious new arguments being made, are people who are making the scientific claim taking those seriously and responding to them? And if all of this is happening, what you'll see sometimes happen is that a consensus emerges, but not just any old consensus. It's not just a poll or a bunch of people saying, yeah, we all agree. It's a consensus that emerges from a critical community. When this happens, then that means that if you can't evaluate the science yourself, this is probably the next best thing we have. One of the interesting things about this is that some of the areas of science that are some of the most controversial are actually some of the ones that follow this the best, precisely because of the controversy. So if you look at something like climate change, the evidence, the models, all of that has been challenged extensively. And that's a scientific community that has responded to all of that and where the evidence is extremely robust. You also see this, for example, with questions about vaccine safety. There's been for decades now people raising questions about the safety of vaccines. Scientists don't just brush those off when they're good faith, serious questions. There's been a lot of research and a lot of evidence, and it actually turns out that there's a lot of evidence for general vaccine safety and efficacy. So some of these controversial areas are sometimes some of the ones where, ironically, we have the best evidence. And so, again, if you can't trust the evidence yourself, as a 76ers fan might say, if you know this history, trust the process. Okay, thanks for watching. Don't forget to do the concept check questions, and I'll see you all next time.